Our session today will focus on Jamaica, a small island in the Caribbean, and as we continue our focus on post-independence development, we move from India, a large country in Asia, at least a country with a very large population, which was focused mainly on internal development, and now we're going to focus on a country in the Caribbean, which is largely focused on trade. We're introducing a new topic, sort of, and we'll come back to this later as we discuss more aspects of international trade in the development equation. The Jamaica story will be introduced with a human interest component, and the lady who we'll focus on to motivate this human interest component is Hortense. Hortense is trained as a practical nurse. However, because of the education in the Jamaican system, she cannot seem to find a job as a nurse. And I'm not saying that Jamaica is a very educated country, but when we look at the data, compared to India, the number of years of schooling in Jamaica were far more than the number of years of schooling in India. This has created many problems because if a country is going to invest heavily in education, the question becomes, education for what purpose? We'll return to the topic education for development at the end of our semester. However, the topic comes up now as we introduce development strategies and we talk about where you should make your investments. When we come to the topic of education and development, we will focus on the contribution of a Nobel Prize winner named Theodore Schultz. And Professor Schultz at the University of Chicago argued that many countries needed to invest in education. And the question became, how much education do you need for development? It turns out to be the case that many countries were very eager about investing in education, and the education was an overinvestment, and it led to frustration and outmigration. But back to the Jamaica development story. Jamaica became independent in 1962, and it became independent in an interesting way. Britain actually offered independence to its Caribbean countries as a single unit. It was called the West Indies Federation, and Jamaica being the largest country in the British West Indies, in terms of where Britain controlled, Jamaica sort of expected that it would be the headquarters for this new nation called the West Indies, the independent nation of the West Indies. However, Jamaica then sought political independence on its own in 1962, as did the next largest country, Trinidad, Twin Islands state of Trinidad and Tobago. And the other countries that made up the West Indies Federation thought of trying to make a go at it on their own without Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago. But that did not happen. The Federation fell apart, and then individually the countries sought independence, political independence from Britain. Let's get back to the Jamaica story. As the largest English-speaking Caribbean country, Jamaica sought political independence, and being a close physical neighbor to Cuba, it seemed to be the case that the individuals in Jamaica who sought political independence were willing to consider an alternative to a capitalist model of economic development. Indeed, India did the same thing. When India put its development plan in place, we saw that India looked north and saw Russia, the Soviet Union, and China, and decided it was going to have some of what they were having rather than capitalism, and it created a mixture of a socialist type development. There are many good reasons why this socialist type development may have been viewed as more desirable than a capitalist model. For one thing, in a capitalist economy, we expect that those who have more resources will speed ahead of those who have fewer resources, and it would take a strong government to fix this inequality problem. Inequality will be a running theme throughout this course. So many countries, as they pursued the independence and development path, decided that maybe capitalism Western style was not what was in their best interest. It also happens to be the case that England was not pursuing this capitalist path. I would say United Kingdom was not pursuing this capitalist path. And at the end of World War II, the Labour Party won the elections. Churchill was out, Attlee was in, and they actually had a system in many European countries that was a welfare state. And the argument was that the country will take care of you from cradle to grave. Of course, many new ex-colonies, many new nations thought that perhaps this was a better model where they would seek to take care of their people. With political independence comes the franchise, one person, one vote. And obviously, if the majority of people are poor and disenfranchised, it is hard to believe that you could be a party of the wealthier class and expect to win in a democracy, in an election process. So you had to find a way to accommodate the masses. Suffice it to say that Jamaica sought a development path. We're going to focus mainly on the fact that as a small nation, created as an export-oriented colony, Jamaica exported bauxite, which is the raw material for aluminum. It exported sugar, and it exported bananas, among other things. So we have a mineral and two agricultural commodities. One of the things we will notice is that if you ask many of these countries about their development plan for the future, it generally did not involve remaining agricultural. The idea that staying with agriculture would keep you backward was so prevalent that many countries thought that perhaps they needed to pursue a manufacturing-oriented strategy. It is when the manufacturing-oriented strategy did not work that they realized that maybe the agricultural strategy was not a bad strategy, but also if you could find another strategy, perhaps you should consider that. Manufacturing was an expensive proposition for countries that were not good at manufacturing, that had to learn how to become manufacturing-oriented. We're going to talk about a strategy that was almost foisted on these countries, but in their seeking for a new development alternative, they were certainly willing to consider this particular strategy. And the strategy is to invite foreign companies to come to your country for your resources, whatever those resources happen to be, and use the production to export whatever was being produced and earn foreign exchange for the country's development. It is as though you're looking for a job and you invite people to come to your country and help you. And we're going to fast forward and tell the story in terms of the United States encouraging manufacturing in Jamaica. So as I tell that story, I need to fast forward to the 1970s. In the 1970s, the incoming Prime Minister of Jamaica was a young man named Michael Manley. Michael Manley was the son of a former Prime Minister of Jamaica, I should say Premier of Jamaica, when Jamaica was still a colony. The first Premier of Jamaica was Michael Manley's father, Norman Manley. Many Jamaicans consider him to be the father of their nation, but there's also another corresponding figure, Bustamante, who was also important in that development or push for independence. Suffice it to say that we're picking up where Michael Manley is the Prime Minister of Jamaica. And Jamaica being close to Cuba, and Michael Manley being an ardent anti-capitalist, he sought to push Jamaica in a path that excluded a capitalist interest. He looked to Cuba. He was a fan of Fidel Castro, and he thought that perhaps Jamaica should consider a more socialist orientation. The development plan that he put in place, his party put in place, was called Democratic Socialism. So it was taking advantage of the fact that the country was a democracy, but also the fact that socialism was still popular among new nations as a path for development. In hindsight, it turns out that this was not the best thing, but at that point, no one knew it was not, and therefore they were willing to try it. Many new nations were considering a strategy that involved government involvement in the economy, and to use a phrase that was popular in Britain, where government would control what is called the commanding heights of the economy, the important industries, because left in the hands of the private sector, these industries would just enrich the individuals who had controlled these industries historically. And the idea was to wrest these industries away from the hands of ardent capitalists who were exploiting the nation and put them in the hands of locals, since there were not many locals who were wealthy enough or had the interests of the nation at heart. It turned out that these resources would be put in the hands of the government for the government to run these industries. Many nations tried this strategy, so we can't say that it's original with Jamaica or original with India. It was thought that this was not a bad strategy. And England, United Kingdom, was trying this strategy, as I mentioned earlier, almost based on Karl Marx's idea that the commanding heights of the economy, the important industries, should be in the hands of the people, and the proxy for the people would be the government. So as we talk about how Jamaica made its development plans, and we mentioned that development planning was in vogue, it was the way forward for several reasons. India developed many 5-year development plans. Notice that the Soviet Union also had 5-year planning. China, 5-year planning. So the idea of having a 5-year plan was very popular. In fact, as you think about it, if you're trying to get a loan from a bank, and you go to the bank and you say, I'd like to borrow X number of dollars, they want to see your plan. So the development agencies that were willing to fund and finance the development of these ex-colonies as new nations wanted to see what your development plan looked like. So every country had a planning department, and the planners sat down and figured out what resources they needed to develop the economy the way they thought was in the best interest. Not free markets, but planning. When Michael Manley became Prime Minister in Jamaica, his opponent was a more capitalist-oriented individual by the name of Edward Seaga. Edward Seaga became the Prime Minister after Michael Manley, but in the 70s, as OPEC was trying to consolidate itself and create a monopoly out of oil, Jamaica thought, perhaps we also have a resource that the world needs. And if the OPEC nations can create a cartel and become wealthy, pretty much strangling the world by managing the oil supplies as they were distributed to the world, Manley proposed to other countries that produce important elements like alumina, bauxite, that they also form a cartel. In other words, let's find ways for the new nations to wrest control of their resources away from the multinational corporations that came to your country and exploited your resource, took it and paid you a small amount. Why not try to get control of, again, what would be a commanding height of your economy? So Michael Manley tried to create this cartel, and hindsight is 2020. The cartel, like most cartels, are unstable. Cartel did not hold together, and that idea did not follow through very well. But anyway, in the development planning, Jamaica pursued this more socialist path, and for several reasons it did not work. By the mid to late 1970s, it was clear that this plan was not working. And in the elections that came up, you can say that the United States was involved in these elections. The CIA was involved in terms of trying to keep Jamaica on a capitalist or not have it go on a socialist path. That the CIA was involved in funding the opposition party. When the opposition party came to power, they sought new industries along a manufacturing orientation. And the story I tell is that the new Prime Minister of Jamaica, who was Edward Seaga, he was the first foreign leader that Ronald Reagan interacted with when Ronald Reagan became President of the United States. So the first foreign dignitary that Ronald Reagan met was the new Prime Minister of Jamaica. Edward Seaga sought to get some resources to help Jamaica. And because the United States had helped him to become the Prime Minister, he said, okay, well, we have these unemployed people and we need jobs. partly because the path that was being pursued was not working, and there are many good stories there that I will not tell right now. The United States decided to help out Jamaica. Why would the US do that? Well, there was the idea that communism was becoming more important, and Fidel Castro in Cuba was a thorn in America's flesh, so to speak. But in Latin America, there were several countries that were pursuing socialist orientations, and when Ronald Reagan came to power, he denounced communism. He told Mr. Gorbachev, take down that wall, and many people say that it is Reagan's insistence and the continued rhetoric that helped to bring an end to the Soviet Union. I'm getting a little off course, so I need to keep my story back on Jamaica. So we're at the point where Edward Seaga has become the new Prime Minister. Jamaica has high unemployment. The 1970s were not favorable years for many developing countries because of two OPEC oil crises, and many of these countries were hurting badly. They needed to borrow financial resources to help fund their development. They needed to get themselves out of high levels of unemployment. But back to the Jamaica story. Edward Seaga meets Ronald Reagan. He thanks Ronald Reagan for the assistance that the U.S. offered to keep Jamaica from going towards the Cuban model. And now the question is, how do we get Jamaica developed? You could say that the planning for the 60s and 70s was at a stalemate, and Jamaica needed a new impetus. Ronald Reagan, the story I tell, offered Jamaica some manufacturing jobs. He offered for American textile apparel companies to relocate to Jamaica and to produce their garments in Jamaica, but not the exclusive production of the garment, to do some aspects of the production that were harder to be done in the United States. There's a lot more to this story than I can tell you in a short video, but I mentioned the multi-fiber arrangement as background. Asia wanted increased access to the U.S. textile apparel market, and American apparel producers knew that they could not win this because production of apparel from Asia was much cheaper than producing garments in the United States. So if the United States could have a part of the process done elsewhere, say the Caribbean, Central America, Latin America, for a very low cost, they could bring the cost of producing these garments down. So we're going to mention the fact that there's this treaty between the United States and the Caribbean called the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act, aka the Caribbean Basin Initiative, which was going to send manufacturing activities to the Caribbean and Latin America for the production process to be facilitated. So the way the policy was structured, the garments had to be made of U.S. material that was cut and formed in the U.S. So effectively you would send huge bundles of pre-cut garments to be sewn in Jamaica or Haiti or the Dominican Republic or somewhere in Latin America. These garments would then return to the United States as American garments, not imports. So the label on the garment would say, made in Jamaica or Haiti or the Dominican Republic of U.S. materials. And when the product came back into the U.S. with that label, it would be considered an American product. There would be no need to pay a tariff to bring it in, and therefore it came in duty-free. Whereas a product from India or somewhere in Asia would come in and they would pay a tariff. So the American producers got a chance to lower their costs by having the troublesome aspects of the labor production done elsewhere, and the product was still counted as an American product, not an import. Here's the human interest. So there's the story that you have to watch, which is about this nurse who couldn't find a job as a nurse, and she went to work for one of these garment factories. There's several segments focused on garment factories because that was the development strategy by default, that manufacturing jobs will come to Jamaica but they were American companies which were relocating to have a small portion of the production process undertaken in Jamaica. I use Jamaica as a proxy for many other countries in the Caribbean. But the point was that the product would be considered an American product and it would come back in duty-free. So you would save on the labor costs, and that's how the American garment companies were going to compete, get their costs down by outsourcing a portion of the production process. So I mentioned the human interest aspect. Hortense, the nurse, can't find a job as a nurse. She works in a garment factory, and she decides that perhaps she needs to go to school to learn how to make a garment from the beginning to the end, because in the factory all you did was one small, boring, repeated aspect of the production process. So you didn't learn anything. You just did the same activity over and over hundreds of times. So sewing buttonholes or sewing collars, that's it. And you would get paid per item that you did, a piece rate, so to speak. So if you were a fast worker, you got paid more than if you were a slow worker. So that's the story. Beyond the human interest story of Hortense and her struggles with her family and trying to make ends meet, I would have to tell you that I like the Hortense story very much. There's a line in the video where she says, "Sometimes I feel like my life is not working." That she has taken this route to education. The education is not producing the promise. And she has these 3 children. Her husband is in the United States trying to make ends meet to support his family, I think. The video doesn't tell you, but it seems as though they were still a unit. But maybe he moved on, and we are not sure about that. But she lived with her 2 aunts in urban Jamaica, because the garment factories would locate close to the port, the airport or the seaport, and therefore you had to be in urban Jamaica to get one of these jobs. Very interesting saga, but I'll let you figure out more of that as you work through the material. So let me tell you how I've organized the material on Jamaica as you look at the Moodle page. First, you will see some videos entitled FTZ Strategy in Jamaica. FTZ Strategy. FTZ stands for Free Trade Zone. This is the area of the country that was cordoned off to host these foreign companies. The workers would go through barricaded gates into this area and participate in the production process. They would leave, full body search sometimes, and they were to make sure they were not bringing anything into Jamaica, because the products were not to be sold in Jamaica. The raw materials were coming in to be sewn so the product could then leave and go back to America on an airplane or a ship, and did not have any interaction with the Jamaicans apart from the workers who came into that free trade zone to do whatever was required of them. One of the interesting aspects of the FTZ strategy is that it provided jobs for women. 95% of the workers in the FTZ were female. So as you think that through, you go for a situation where the development strategy, this is what would be considered an unintended consequence. The development strategy is providing jobs that are gender biased. Let's think that through. So we're not providing jobs for men, we're providing jobs in the urban area for women. Unintended consequence. You want the jobs, but you take what comes, and this is what comes. Jobs for women. As you think this through, women are willing to take lower wages than men for the same job. This is an international statistic. So many companies, if they have a preference, or choice I should say, between male workers and female workers for the same job, would choose female workers because the wage bill would be lower. So as you look at the Moodle page, you'll notice the FTZ strategy, and under that I talk about the origins of the FTZ strategy in Jamaica, the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan is the President of the United States and Edward Seaga is the Prime Minister of Jamaica. I should tell you that the products that were being re-exported to America were under a special paragraph on the U.S. tariff schedule, the USTS paragraph 807. And you'll hear 807 being mentioned. That's one paragraph in the U.S. tariff schedule. that focus on products being imported into America, but if the raw materials were American raw materials, the product would be considered an American product for tax purposes, and there would be no import tariffs applied. Ultimately, what I need for you to do is to think of the impact of the FTZ strategy on Jamaica. I've mentioned the gender bias in the strategy. Where are the men? What are the men doing? Hortense's husband has come to America to look for a job. But if you are starting out as a more rural economy and jobs are being created, industrial jobs in the urban area, there has to be some migration. So we see the rural to urban migration as well as the international migration, both aspects showing up in this particular development strategy. After I talk a little bit about the manufacturing-oriented FTZ strategy, I want to focus on the rest of the economy. So we go back to the rural area and we focus on agriculture and mining. Mining being the bauxite raw material and the agriculture. In fact, more of the attention should be focused on agriculture because I think we understand that better. So in focusing on agriculture, I mentioned that the agricultural strategy was part of an international strategy. For many colonies, you were exporting raw materials or commodities to the mother country, and you accepted whatever price they paid. Obviously, they were not trying to make you rich in the process, but now as an independent nation, how do you negotiate with your ex-colonizer to move forward in agriculture? I think I mentioned that England was not in a position to give large golden handshakes to its ex-colonies. So what they did was they set up a process where they would continue to purchase the commodities from these countries, and that was their largesse or their gift, their parting gift to these countries, that they would import the products in a similar fashion and would allow these countries to sell the products to them without having to pay tariffs, import tariffs. So it's similar to what the U.S. was doing when the U.S. brought manufacturing to Jamaica and the product was re-exported to America duty-free. In the case of the ex-colonial relationship, the former colonizer was allowing the ex-colony to sell their agricultural products duty-free. Similar idea, but another country trying to sell the same product to England, for example, would have to pay an import tariff. This became the challenge known as the banana case, where Latin American banana producers argued that Europe should not give preferential treatment to its ex-colonies in importing their bananas, or whatever the product might be. There's a lot of hypocrisy in international trade, and when we back off and study the situation, what the U.S. was doing is effectively the same thing as what England was doing. I should mention that there are times when the U.S. would import products from the Caribbean and other places duty-free, but then when Britain tried to do it or Europe tried to do it, they would object. So all's fair in love and war, I guess. The agricultural issue has many sides. It's not only the exporting and the challenges of having another country argue against your exporting to another country. For example, Jamaica selling bananas to England duty-free, whereas other countries can't sell bananas to England duty-free. They have to pay a tariff. There's the other side of the agricultural equation, importing agricultural products. I should mention that part of the development strategy of Jamaica included an industry called tourism. Because of the beautiful beaches and the nice weather in winter, many spring breakers would head to Jamaica. Many hotels on the north and west coast of Jamaica were happy to receive all of the tourists that could come. The hotels were multinational hotels for the most part, so it's not like Jamaica was getting rich from this particular strategy. But as these companies sought to source raw materials to provide food for their guests, they imported many of the raw materials. They imported many of the agricultural products. So many Jamaican farmers thought, well, if we are going to have a tourism industry, we should be able to supply the products that we can to the domestic industry. It only shows the Goya, right? There is that level of, okay, we want carrots and beets and we want milk and we want other products that the guests can have, but we want to bring them from America. Jamaican farmers are saying, we can supply these products, but Jamaican farmers aren't getting the opportunity to supply the products. Of course, as agricultural products become more expensive, the government has to figure out, do we subsidize the farmers or do we have the farmers do the best they can? Once the foreign product comes into Jamaica, if it comes in cheaper than the local farmers can produce it, clearly the preference will go towards the imported product versus the Jamaican agricultural product, even among Jamaicans. So this created an interesting situation for the Jamaican farmers, who found that imports were crowding them out of the market because they could not produce some of these commodities at low enough prices. So we have the export side of Jamaican agriculture, the bananas, the sugar, etc. And then we have the import side of the Jamaican agricultural sector, so the vegetables and the other food supplies that need to be produced. There's another interesting case I need for you to look at. I call it Mcdonald's in Jamaica. So let's talk about the tourism industry and the tourists wanting food that they're familiar with. Why not McDonald's and KFC and other things that are American? It turns out that there was a company in Jamaica by the name of McDonald's, but it was not the Golden Arches. It was a Jamaican company. So imagine your name is McDonald and you have a restaurant and you call it McDonald's Restaurant. There happens to be an international chain also called McDonald's. The international chain seeks to come to your country, and they say, if we come to your country, that company called McDonald's Restaurant needs to close or change their name because we are McDonald's. They can't share our name. So you might be Mr. McDonald and you have to change your name because an American company wants to come into your country and claim that you are using their trademark. Another interesting story that needs to be explored. Who gets to have the rights to names for important names? So we're talking about world intellectual property, world copyright laws, etc. So the international world is now impinging. So the international world is now impinging on your local economy and saying, if you want to play with the big dogs, then you have to play by the international rules. So you can't be a Jamaican McDonald's. You have to be Jamaican something else. So I mentioned that case in the story, and you'll figure that out as well. A lot of material. I hope that you understand the idea. Development with a trade or international focus, because the economy is so small that the development can be internal without an international focus. Not when you've grown up, so to speak, as a player in the international market, whether you're exporting bananas or sugar or bauxite or whatever the case might be. Know that you're importing food supplies to feed tourists. What happens to the local farmers? You have this development strategy where you've overinvested in education, but there are no jobs. You don't have the right mix of jobs for the education that you've invested in. How do you resolve that? So when jobs come, individuals who don't have the right skill set end up taking these jobs. These jobs clearly cannot have a high human capital component. So you need to have some basic level of education, and the jobs that will come, the companies that will send their jobs there will say, gee, we will only send jobs that we know your people can perform. And that's the sad reality. The jobs don't match the educational levels, so you have overeducated individuals performing jobs that are beneath them because they need a job. The country cannot supply enough jobs for the level of education that it's pursuing. So that's the Jamaica story, at least the introduction to the Jamaica story. I trust that you will enjoy thinking this through, the development strategies, the politics of the equations, the economics of the equations, and the social dynamics of the equation, especially when you start to consider the gender dynamic. So that's your second session. Enjoy.